Okay, so I've started this stream because I screwed up the last one in trying to move from the phone that I had logged in through. I had unfortunately um I had pressed the wrong button to leave. So I am actually back upstairs in my usual office spot, and we're just waiting for Saba. I've sent him the link. Well, click on it. It should work. That's the new link, I believe. Oh no, it's not. It's not. It's not. Okay, hold on, Saba. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. So now we're just waiting. Okay, let's see. Yeah, nice. The gremlins and the Kremlin must be behind this. I wish. No, that was me screwing it up, guys. I screwed it up. Yes, this is the live one. We crashed out live. We back up live. We're waiting for Saba, and hopefully he just clicks in or goes. He may be doing it through his computer. All right, he's coming back. Welcome back, Saba.
Okay.
You want to present a document? You can do that now because this is a desktop version. That's my fault.
I I don't even know what's going on. I'm having so many technical problems. So I guess we're back.
We're live.
Um,
We are live.
okay. I don't know if I should go over
Uh oh.
to
Oh
do
no.
here. Um, so where we left off, I just talked about up to the liturgical
Right.
updating of Patriarch Nikon.
Yeah, you were up to 1652, and then you were
Yes,
going
and
to
I
show
wanted to
something.
mention, okay, which I'm afraid to because I'm having technical issues on my end. I was going to talk about Patriarch Macarios III of Antioch.
Okay.
Um, that being uh,
The famous
liturgical
travels.
here, Macarios. Yes, Macarios III Ibn al-Zahim. He traveled to Russia multiple times, but he wrote a book which I highly recommend. He traveled throughout the Russian lands in 1652, so right before the Acts of Patriarch Nikon. And that book, I don't know if I know what Enoch mentioned it, and I was going to talk about it a little bit. He really shows how much the quote unquote old ritualist had deviated from the traditions and the liturgical norms of the church. It was all over the place. He basically went to Patriarch Nikon and said, "This is a circus. What's going on in these churches? There's people doing whatever they want." And then these people were going around saying that it was the correct way to do it, and that anyone else who did the anyway, any other way was a heretic. It was absolute clown show, and it doesn't help that any attempt to update the liturgical practices of the church was being considered by these people to be no different than what the Protestants or the Counter Reformationists in the Roman Catholic Church were doing at that time. So Patriarch Macarios III of Antioch wrote a book where he talked a lot about that. But at first, this was not well received, including by many of the people of the Zealots of Piety that Patriarch Nikon had belonged to. One of the leaders of this was a man by the name of who was a priest monk. His last name, I can pull it up here, Petrov. Arvukum Petrov was one of the main people in the Zealots of Piety movement, and he was one of the most vocal against the reforms of Patriarch Nikon. In fact, he argued that Constantinople fell because they used the sign of the cross with three fingers like this, rather than the two fingers like the old ritualists do. There was also the fact that many of the old ritualists started getting very violent. We're skipping ahead a little bit, but I have it up here. Where is it? I think it's right up here. Like, for example, many of the old ritualists started rising up against the Tsar in the Russian church and starting revolts and revolutions, which is very notable since this is only about 40 years after the Zimsky Sobor, where the Russian people and the Russian church took a vow to the Romanov dynasty under Tsar Fyodor Romanov. At this time, it was Tsar Alexei Romanov. A lot of it also got tied to a lot of the anti-feudal movements of the time. And we'll talk a little bit about the uprisings, but the most famous one, for example, of course, happened is the Moscow uprising of 1682. So we're still a few years away from that. So they brought the liturgical practices of Russia into the same practices that are being used in the rest of the Orthodox world and what the Russians and Monothos were already using. And of this group of the Russian bishops, only 3 dissented. 2 later returned, and then one of them, the only old ritualist bishop, was Pavel of Kolymna. Pavel, now this is one thing I'll just briefly mention here. The old ritualists claim that Pavel of Kolymna was burned at the stake and killed for the old rite. That's not true. Almost every primary source simply says that he reposed in peace in a monastery, and he was not burned at the stake or whatnot, which we'll get into that and some of their histories. But of course, you had people like Avokum, who were, of course, claiming that anyone who ever made the sign of the cross like this was now a heretic and devoid of grace. And this led to sort of the what's the term I'm looking for? Some of the fanaticism around this led to people raising up revolts. I just mentioned the Moscow revolt of 1682. One of the people involved in this, who the old ritualists also considered a martyr, is Nikita Pustaviet, who was a nobleman who was follower of the old ritualists, and he tried to, he was also formerly a priest. He tried to revolt against the church and revolt against the Tsar and led a rebellion. So you have these old ritualists. Of course, one of the most famous things, they at one point took over the Solovki monastery, which one of the books I'll be reading from is this book here. I don't know if you can see it. It's mirrored, I think, but it's the A Little Russian Philokalia, Volume 5 on St. Theodorus and Oxar, which this is more of the new Plantina books. But I think in this section it briefly talks about the revolt on Sovoletsky monastery. So let me see if I can find it. It's page 44. I had it in here. I can't find it now. Now it's mentioned later on. I marked 3 pages here, and yes, I do just have scrap paper for it. Let's see, page 50. Okay, so this talks about the part of the uprising, which is Pugachev's uprising. Now, I will just read verbatim here, so there's some context I'll try to add in. A week after his departure, Pugachev's band came to the city of Timkunov and looted the city. Archimandrite Feofan Sokolov adds to the life of Elder Theodore the following account. I was also a witness of the fate that eventually befell the Voivod Nilov after the passage of only a week following the banishment of Father Theodore to Solovki Monastery. Burgachev's band came to the city. The voivode left the town with great haste, taking all his money with him. Ever traveling by the Synaxar monastery, he repented that he had sinned before Father Theodore and traveled in haste to the Shatsk area with his retinue. But inasmuch as Nilov came to Shatsk without informing anyone who he was, he caused a great commotion in the town, for they thought that Pugachev's band had come. He was fined because of this, and also because he had left the city undefended. In a short while he died there, and Shatsk having publicly repented of the evil that he committed against the elder. Purgachev's band was destroyed and plundered his city, but they sent word to Synaxar not to be afraid. At that time, I, Father Theophan, had not left the monastery, although others in no small numbers had fled into the forest. But they had returned upon hearing that Purgachev's band would not come to the monastery. Just for note, this is Emilian Purgachev, who was one of the many Old Ritualists, and this is in the 1700s. The Old Ritualists were still trying to basically rise up bandit gangs and destroy monasteries and cities. So even almost a century after, as this is during the reign of Empress Catherine II, Old Ritualists were getting these bands of bandits together and destroying monasteries, which the same section also talks about the Solovki Monastery, which is where the 1682 revolt occurred. This was written by Father Gerasim, who is now an OCA bishop, or this was translated by him. I don't know who originally wrote this. But he writes, the famous northernmost Lavra of the Holy Russia was a 15th century monastic citadel where great ascetics worked out their salvation. In the 17th century, the monastics were held captive by militant conservatives, ultra-conservative forces during a fierce Old Believers uprising, which was eventually brought under control and Old Believer schismatics. Thus, it also served as a prison for such great men as St. Joshua, the founder of the Golgotha Skete. So this thing of Old Ritualists going around trying to murder people was pretty common. Now, I hear many people probably already saying, but they persecuted the Old Ritualists. They did terrible things to them. Well, you have to realize many people like Nikita Pustavyat and what's the famous one's name? Feodosia Morozova and Eudoxia, her companion, what's her last name? I can't remember her name. It's here somewhere. Let's see. It's mentioned somewhere here. Evdokia Erasova. You have to realize these people were involved in revolts against the Tsar that only 40 years before the entire Russian church gave an oath to protect. These people were not martyrs for religious causes. These people were basically terrorists, and they did horrible things. There was bands of these people going around for centuries in Russia, burning down monasteries. And as I mentioned, the Old Ritualists will lie about who they will say was martyred. They'll say that this Pavel Kolmina was martyred when he was simply just died in peace in a monastery. And they said that, this man Orthojust, which I was going to address a bit of that. But of course, if you look at like Avakum was blessing these people and inciting these people.
Hold on. Bishop Enoch is here. Master Bless.
God bless.
So because I know this is a topic that's of interest to both of you, so I guess I'll
just let Sava continue, and after he stops, I'll say something.
Okay, so I'll finish up a little bit talking about the initial context. Of course, we went over the we went over the sort of what led to Patriarch Nikon's reforms, quote unquote. I don't like that term; it's a very loaded term. And also, some people might notice I'm not calling them Old Believers, because we Orthodox are the Old Believers. These people are Old Ritualists. I know that might seem harsh, but I will talk more about the Old Rite later on. But of course, one of the things that sealed Patriarch Nikon's reforms was the Great Moscow Sobor of 1666, which that eschatological character I mentioned about the Russian people during the times of trouble is very important, because they said, oh, look, the mark of the beast, this is what it's referring to. It's the mark of the beast, that they're trying to push these reforms, like making the sign of the cross with 3 fingers in the year 666. So that, of course, was something that these people started going on about, which we can talk more about that later. But this confirmed a lot of things. I know some people are probably also shouting, oh, the Great Moscow Sobor was crazy, and I'm not here saying that it was the greatest thing ever, But you notice that a majority of people in Russia went along with the Nikonian rite, and they had no issues with it. Whereas the people that did have issues with it were going around burning monasteries and burning down monasteries and trying to overthrow the Tsar. And we'll talk more about the very anti-monarchical nature of the Old Ritualists. But I'll finish here, and I'll, of course, let the Enoch uh, introduce himself here.
Okay. So all I was going to go through was my interest in the subject is mainly concerns the Travels of Macarios, which was written by Paul of Aleppo, and the Travels of, and he deals with the subject a lot. I mean, Macarios wasn't necessarily, Patriarch Macarios had problems, but so Patriarch Macarios was the Patriarch of Antioch, and he traveled to Russia in the 1640s and the 1650s, and he was also at the Moscow Sobor in 1666-67. And his son, Paul of Aleppo, wrote the account. It's a 2-volume set. Was translated in the 19th century, I believe. And Patriarch Macarios originally been a married priest. His wife had died, and then he became a monk, and then he later was made Patriarch of Antioch. Long story, right? So, the account is actually interesting because it talks about Macarios going through Romania and all these other places, and it's actually interesting for a lot of the material it reveals and such. So, the content. So I'll just go through. I haven't listened to everything you said, Sava. So if I have a different view on it matters or whatever, then we'll just talk about that. But I'm just going to go through how I interpreted it after reading the Travels of Macarios. So before, and also there's a book. There were some works by Dr. Kaparov, who died in 1910. And he was sort of like one of the great scholars of the in Russia of the situation. The old believer, old ritualist, what have you situation, right? So, some of the context was that prior to the reforms or the changes or whatever, how you ever want to phrase it, everyone sort of acknowledged that there were actually problems in the Russian books. It didn't mean they were heretical. I mean, they were remember, when you're dealing with manuscripts before the printing press, you can have a lot of different traditions, and some of those traditions can, hundreds of scribes, thousands of manuscripts. They can be 99% the same, right? But then you can have spelling issues. Certain books lack things. This causes all kind of problems. For example, in the 1380s or so, there was this sort of, or 1400s, I think maybe, there was this controversy in Pskov about how many Alleluias do you sing at, let's say, the office. Okay, is it Alleluia, 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 glory to thee, O Lord, or God? Okay, or is it Alleluia, Alleluia? All right. And most people are familiar with just the 3 Alleluias, right? In Pskov, they were singing 3 Alleluias, all right? And then there were some people in a nearby city who said, no, this is heresy. This is like Latin heresy or something. You have to sing 2 Alleluias. So Kaparov and others kind of pointed that out because it does illustrate that it wasn't like from 988 until 1650 or something like that. Everybody was just doing exactly the same thing in Russia. And I think some of the old ritualists, I mean, even the term old ritualist isn't necessarily the best term because, there were Edinoverie people who were called old ritualists, that just means the old ritual, So rascal, an actual schismatic, right? That's probably the better term. Yes. But, so the problem is that they will say that everything was done exactly this way in Russia until this point. All right, because they have a view of what's called mono-ritualism, which means if there's some minute variation, then grace ceases. All right, and like the World Congress of All Believers, the head of that, he's made statements, just absolutely crazy things, which simply would not make sense historically, if you look at how the church has existed historically. So you have these differences. And when it was asked of the Metropolitan, I think it was the Metropolitan of Kiev at the time, or Moscow, and he said, if you want to use 3 on the Pskov situation, he said he doesn't really think this is a big deal. Later maybe the church will have a council and will just discuss about how the ritual books are done. Right? So that was sort of the situation. And in the 1500s, you did have I believe, a Saint Maxim the Greek, for example. He came into Russia. I don't know if you mentioned him, and he noticed, he was an expert he was in Greek himself, and I think he came from Mount Athos, I believe, and he came into Russia. He knew Russian. He learned Slavonic, and he noticed, there were discrepancies from in various books in different places, and he brought these up, and people, got upset at him as well. So so that there was variation going on. It wasn't like there was like one uniform practice until this certain point. Now, what's true is when they had the Stoglov Sobor in the 1570s or 1556, I can't quite remember.
1551.
Yeah, in the Stoglov Sobor, they did say, okay, we're going to do this. That did create problems because the factions or parties that began to were saying things like, oh, anathema to those who say three alleluias. And when this got reported on Mount Athos, the Russian monks were like, how can we publish this? Because are we going to like anathematize like Greek monks right beside us? It created significant problems. Although my understanding is that technically the Russian church did not break communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople or the other patriarchs at the time. So I don't know exactly what their anathema almost was maybe local for internal use. It doesn't really explain itself. So there were all these sort of contradictions adding up over time. And you even get to the point where I think Katparov points out that in like the early 1600s, Greek merchants would come to Moscow, and like the Russian priest would be like, "Oh, you're not really baptized," and how do we know you really were baptized by triple immersion? And we just don't believe you. And so they would like make people go and get rebaptized and rechristimated, and this was just creating all kinds. Even though the metropolitan might say, "Don't do this," it still happened a lot. There were other problems that Patriarch Macarios points out, which were legitimate problems. For example, practices had grown up in Russia. So my point is that there were actually need for reform in a good sense, not the loaded sense. There were actually issues that had to be taken care of. And you had two factions. They were called, there's a Russian name, and I don't remember the name for it, but it was called the Zealots of Piety in English.
Yes.
Yeah, and part of those became what we think of as like Avicum and his people. The other became like Nikon and his people. All right. But early on, there were all these problems. And for example, one problem was that the apostolic canons say that you do not reordain somebody when they you don't do reordination if they have a true ordination. Okay, but in Russia, the practice had grown up was that if a bishop was, let's say, he was the Archbishop of Novgorod, and then he becomes Metropolitan of Moscow, they would bring him to Moscow. And they would basically do the election for a bishop service, and then they do the whole consecration service over again. So when you got transferred from one see to another, you got reordained. So theoretically, you have bishops who are getting like reordained 2, 3, 4 times. Now you can say, you shouldn't be translating people from see to see without a necessity according to the canons. That's true, but the canons never talk about, like Saint Gregory of Nyssa. The theologian Nazianzen was not reordained when he became Bishop of Constantinople, for example, I believe. So there were these issues. There were other issues in Russia. For example, Patriarch Macarios and others point out that, like Russians, they actually, in many places in Russia, this was a big issue. People would only venerate icons once a year. They'd actually only kiss icons on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and they wouldn't do it any other time. They didn't pass out Antidoran except on Pascha Day. Sometimes you can say it's because there was the Suddite typicon that got brought in versus the typicon of Saint Sabas from Palestine, but that doesn't explain all these types of issues, because Saint Theodore the Suddite obviously was a big defender of icons. All right. So so there's various explanations of what happened. One is that people had sort of this overly legalistic understanding of like ritual purity, and they're like, oh, you can't kiss an icon except on this day because you've undergone a certain amount of penances and things like that. So there are numerous problems that were creeping up, and for all the problems, and I can later explain Macarius of Antioch's problems, Macarius II or III, Macarius, I can't remember his name. Yeah, but he was right in pointing out, you got these issues going on here, and these aren't just like minor points. You're going to have to do something about this, and I think they did, and so there's a certain point in which all the zealots of piety are like, okay, you're right, we shouldn't do some of this stuff. You know what I mean? And then it gets to the point with the ritual book question. Now, there were previous corrections of ritual books back in the 1620s, 30s under Patriarch Philaret, who was the father of the Tsar. There was a Patriarch Job, I believe. He made corrections, and they had printing presses. And I should also point out that Metropolitan of Kiev, the famous one who wrote the Catechism that got corrected, whose name Peter Mogila, he actually did do book corrections and did change over to the rite of the Byzantine books being used in Constantinople. I mean, it's oftentimes a misnomer to call it, as the old believers or whatever say, old rite, because when you talk about that, it's like, I mean, the differences are not supremely different. You know what I mean? They come from various different books and such, so they're really usages. And so he made that change, and there were people who complained. But in the case of what happened in Ukraine, Metropolitan Peter Mogila's view was, I'm just going to publish these books. I'm going to say I'm making these corrections. If you don't like it, then just complain about it. He avoided trying to use state enforcement of things. There seems to be a difference between his personality and Patriarch Nikon's. Patriarch Nikon, I think, was more of an imperious person. That's not necessarily bad. There are a lot of imperious people in church history, like Saint Theodore of Canterbury was imperious, and how he treated like some of the Celtic clergy and things like that for good reason, because they were killing people in some cases. But and then there was Patriarch Paisius of Constantinople, who sort of wrote a letter in reply. There's something called the 1654 Synod that happened also, and it was discussing like the book changes as well. And now Patriarch Paisius of Constantinople wrote to Patriarch Nikon, and his point, and he was like answering questions. It's a long letter, and it's got like 100 questions he answers or something like that. And then Patriarch Paisius still says, look, he seemed to detect there was something wrong in Pola Columna, and there was an archpriest, John of Neron or something like that, I can't remember, in their attitude. And that Patriarch Paisius didn't quite understand. For example, Pola Columna and others would say, if you change, if you do this, if you make the procession in this direction and that direction, if you do this or do that, these are sort of moderate to minor, really not really essential differences, then you cease being Orthodox. And Patriarch Paisius' view is that this is some sort of schism or heresy. All right, that when there's no change in the rite that affects the dogmatic and constitutional nature of the faith, he doesn't understand why they're objecting to this. All right. Now, he did tell Patriarch Nikon, you got to be careful, because if you have people in Russia that are behaving like this, and you start to try to force this too much, it can backfire. All right. But it is what it is. So, they obviously went through that, and the alterations are now, ironically, Patriarch Nikon was deposed at the 1666-67 Sobor, sort of like the Sobor that ratified his changes, or the books that he brought in, ultimately deposed him, because there were people who were willing to accept. So remember, the zealous of piety is not just Nikon. It's the zealous of piety that became quote unquote the Nikonians. It's not just Nikon. It's like groups of other people. All right,
Everyone belonged to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, remember, it broke off into two different groups. So there's the Old Ritualists, Avicum, and then there's the group that went with Nikon, who were like, we have to make some changes because there are problems. All right. So Nikon is deposed. Now, Nikon himself makes actually interesting defense, and Palmer does a translation of Nikon's defense in a book called The Tsars and the Patriarch. And at the Sobor, so the Sobor, they claim they're going to depose Patriarch Nikon for things like him reordaining bishops when they go to different sees. And Patriarch Nikon's like, okay, all right, if this was wrong, then I admit it. But you have to remember, everybody else at this Sobor also was doing the exact same thing. So it's kind of wrong to sort of point me out and throw me under the bus when everybody else accepted this or did this. And part of it seems to have been based upon a mistranslation, or not mistranslation, sort of not of a great translation of certain of the apostolic canons in the Kamchaya Kaninga. All right. So they translate them from Greek into Slavonic, and there was something about the translation that made it vague about the reordination canon. I've read about it, but I can't quite remember all the details at the moment. And they go through that, and Patriarch Nikon, was deposed. I think later, after he dies, he is rehabilitated after death, and they allowed. And even though the patriarch at the time of Moscow didn't really like him, uh, the ecumenical patriarch and other patriarchs were like, well, we can commemorate him as an actual dead patriarch, reposed patriarch. So he was sort of vindicated, at least in that sense. All right. Um, so again, the issue, like you brought up, is most people went along with this because even if, you have people like there was a hieromonk or Father Arseny Sokarov, who was sort of always at Holy Trinity Lavra, and he was always friendly with Patriarch Nikon, but he didn't agree with the changes. Now, he never left and went into join with the Old Believers or Old Ritualists. And we do have sort of his report from the 1650s where he interviewed the patriarchs in the Middle East, and he didn't have very net positive things to say about them because of a lot of issues that would just take too much time to get into right here. So there certainly were those people, and I think you can say that there were legitimate critiques of how they did everything. But the main problem that the Old Believers have, or Old Ritualists, or the Raskolniki, however, now technically it was illegal to call them Raskolniki in Russia after 1758 because Catherine the Great demanded the bishops take off the anathema against the two-finger sign of the cross, which they in fact did. And that sort of paved the way for the Edinoverie and such, which actually was wildly successful. All right, as soon that under especially Metropolitan Platon Levashin in the 1780s and 90s, and then Metropolitan Filaret Drozdov in the 19th century. So that's sort of the situation. Again, one of the major problems is if you're going to be Archpriest Avacum and his people, and you're going to claim you are the true Church of God on earth, and it gets to the point where you have no bishops, and it's 50 years, and you're having to get people, and you're claiming the quote-unquote Nikonian bishops, or the Russian Church, you're claiming they're heretics and schismatics, and it's, again, now it's 1790, 1800, 150 years later, and you have no one to give you priests except schismatic heretics, but you're claiming you're the church. This is, frankly, an unheard of situation. The quantity of time has gone by to qualitatively, because remember, they searched and searched for trying to find somebody who would be like an old believer or old ritualist, whatever bishop, and they simply could not find anybody. All right, because they were, and it was only in 1848 under this Metropolitan Ambrose who they may have, seems to have been some people sort of lied to him about certain things. He spoke Greek. He didn't necessarily speak Russian, by the way. That, again, yes, I'm not saying all bishops are morally perfect. That's not the point. The point is that the church has to have an episcopate to do ordinations. All right. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that, and it's 100 years, decades later, then this is a significant sign that you are not part of the church. Because remember, the Old Believers or Old Ritualists or what have you, they weren't simply claiming to be like an interest group within the Russian church that was trying to say, we don't want this to happen, we don't like this, but we're still going to sort of go to communion and things like that. That's sort of an important point to bring up and such. So, that's sort of my spiel. I think you mentioned some material before me, and the one other thing I bring up is when Metropolitan Ambrose joined the Old Believers in 1848, I believe, at Bela Crinița. He had to read out the condemnations of the New Rite, and I think it was spelled out in Greek, but it was Slavonic, spelled out in Greek, because he didn't know it was phonetically spelled out. All right, so he had no idea what he was actually saying. All right, and then he does the single hand consecration, and then the next day they do the other consecrations and what have you. All right, so obviously this creates a problem and what have you. And I think it's interesting that when you look at the old believer, the Bela Crinița people, there was a name for them, whatever, the Rogozhny cemetery people, what have you. I know this is all sort of confusing because the Old Believers don't seem to have been a united group. They seem to have been like hundreds, like different little communities, all right? Because how could they be? They don't have a synodal structure. It simply does not exist in that functioning way. And they seem to have asked questions of Metropolitan Ambrose, like, did he believe in the seven councils? Did he accept the they were like, oh, they said, oh, he is an Orthodox bishop. All right. And he's part of the Orthodox Church. Well, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Because on the one hand, they're saying that to use these rituals puts you into schism and heresy automatically. But on the other hand, they're saying this guy has valid apostolic succession, he has grace, and he's an Orthodox bishop, but he needs to be anointed with chrism to make him I don't think they had a well thought out system, if at all, about this situation. So, again, I think comparisons of the old believers or the old rituals, what have you, to anybody other groups is oftentimes they're lacking. You're sort of making comparisons of, like, there's this group of people who don't like changes, therefore they're the same as another group of people who don't like changes. But the content is, what's the content of the changes? All right. I have no problem with the changes. I didn't think anything when I've looked at these different types of books, and I thought, okay, they both look orthodox to me. In fact, when you look at, there was a Paul Meyendorff, who was the son of John, the OCA priest, obviously, but he did write a book about he analyzed the actual manuscripts. And one of the things he brought out was that the old believer or old ritualist argument of a pure ritual that was always done in the Byzantine Church going back to like 700 or whatever simply was not an accurate representation of the matter. You had the Typicon of Saint Sabas. You had the Typicon, the Studite Typicon. You had various different books being used. It just simply was not an accurate representation of history. And if you build your arguments upon that exclusively, all right, and you're not willing to budge or give any credit to another's position about, because look, you're having people in Pskov in the 1300s singing Alleluia 3 times, which should be impossible according to the old believer narrative. All right. That if you do that, you're painting yourself into such a corner for some other reason. I don't know why. It could be, again, Kaparov seems to think that because of these other problems that existed in Russia, which again doesn't mean Russians weren't Orthodox before this time. It doesn't mean they weren't saints in Russia. You can always have a period in church history where there's like 300-400 years, whatever, and there are kind of creeping problems that show up. All right. That doesn't mean there can't be saints in the meantime or what have you. But Kaparov seems to have had the consideration that, their understanding of people's understanding, Russians' understanding of Orthodox, at least a prominent faction of them, seemed to be, again, he uses the word like legalistic. It seemed to not necessarily penetrate too much into the inner essence of the faith. I know people may think that's offensive to them and such, but that seems to be the analysis I would agree with if you're having such a brutal reaction. I can say some of the reaction was simply because of how they did things, but then again, you have a point of some of these people like burning down monasteries and killing themselves and setting themselves on fire. This also creates a problem where if you're the Russian state, how are you supposed to react to sort of this like group of people doing things like that? All right. And if you're the patriarch, how are you supposed to react? Because, I mean, if I were to say, here, I'm publishing a new edition of, this liturgical book, and there are these like different changes in it, but I can base them upon other texts, and then people go crazy and they try to kill me. All right. I might not, I think you would understand if I want to excommunicate them because of that. All right. That there's something going on in this mindset. So I think that's sort of the basis of it. Father Joseph seems to have left, but we have comments. Let me see if we can go to the comments real quick, Sava, and then we'll let you go talk. Let's see. Nicholas Baugman says Ambrose was never allowed in the Russian Empire. He made bishop for all believers in Romania and had this seat there until he reposed. That's true. That's right. That's what I said. Someone says they all died off. They claim they all died off. I'm not sure that the context of that.
We'll talk about Biloklinitskaria.
Oh yeah,
later.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't know where I jumped in the middle of things, so I just sort of went all over the place because I wasn't quite sure where we were at.
Okay. Well, I was. I want to add a few points to what you were talking about, Vladika. I think you're very correct in your assessment. Before we get into the ecclesiology and the old rite itself, what it actually is, I think you make a very good point that the Old Ritualists themselves would venerate many saints who made the sign of the cross like this and did these heretical practices. So this position is not very consistent. And as you mentioned, comparing it to, oh, these people are against change, therefore they're similar to these people over here that are against change. They did not introduce making the sign of the cross like this into Russia so they could get closer to Anglicans and Roman Catholics, like they changed the calendar.
Oh yes, well, obviously, and by the time they made this, and by the time the change of the three finger sign of the cross, I doubt there were any Roman Catholics making the sign of the cross or three fingers by that time.
Yes.
I think that by the time you get to the late medieval, early Renaissance period, that had basically been replanted by the Roman Catholic, like the whole five fingers and things, that had already ended completely.
Yes.
And so, and even the Alleluia question of it doesn't make a lot of sense, because I've read this numerous times. Like, what are they talking about? Latin? I mean, because I know the way I'm Western Rite, and I've studied this, so I was like, what are they mentioning here? And so the best I can figure is that because in the Mass Ordo, the ancient Roman Mass, they at the liturgy or the Mass, they sing Alleluia twice, then a verse, and then Alleluia. That's three Alleluias, but that has nothing to do with like the office, the divine office. All right, where like, or the matins or vespers. It's like it's almost like some of these people were sort of hearing things, half distorted reports, and then trying to accuse others of doing something. To me, it's a very odd. A lot of these accusations were like very odd and strange. Some of them were like, oh, they're using 5 prosphora instead of 7 prosphora to do the proscomini. Very many of these were, odd points to get sort of upset about and things like that. So,
Yes. With the Alleluia thing, you mentioned that. I was going to bring that up. The Old Ritualists claim that saying Alleluia, Alleluia, Slava Tebi Bože, they claim that Alleluia means glory to God, which it doesn't. But that's apparently was one of the points they were arguing about. And again, we'll talk about this much later, but these people are not above lying. We already mentioned Pavel of Kolumna, who they claim was burned at the stake, but he died in peace in a monastery.
Because Patriarch Nikon said he didn't kill him. They accused Nikon of killing Paul of Kolumna. But when they brought this issue up to him at the Sobor, Patriarch Nikon's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
All right.
Actually, if you look at Patriarch Nikon's acts and Tsar Alexei's acts, they never issued any acts directly against the Old Ritualists. They issued acts against people who were using it as a way to try to stir up revolts and uprisings, but they never actually directly persecuted people because they made the sign of the cross like this.
Yes.
So I think this is a really good time to talk about the Old Rite itself and what it actually is, which I'll just throw it out here. This book here, which I know it's mirrored, but this is the Old Orthodox Prayer Book. It's based off books that were written by or printed by Patriarch Joachim of Russia.
I think I have that. I have a copy of that somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the one that's the Old Ritualist there with the Rokor, the Erie Church.
Yes,
so this book goes over some of them. Of course, we already talked about 2 Alleluias. They do they go out the altar, the deacon doors, going counterclockwise rather than clockwise, or no, clockwise rather than counterclockwise. You mentioned the prosphora. There's these small differences, and he's in the chat, Nikolai Bauman. We were actually talking about this the other day, me and our dearest brother Nikolai, that calling the Old Rite a separate rite from the quote-unquote new rite, the Nikonian rite, is almost a misnomer. It's not, as you mentioned, different rites. It's different usages. Yes. And people talk about like, oh, the Old Ritualists do so many prostrations. Well, if you go to a weekday liturgy, even in the new rite, you'll notice that we do prostrations as well.
Yes.
It's completely incorrect to really phrase this like it's a different thing. Which there was an article I was going to read about this. But I think we went over what the Old Rite is and what these people were upset about. We went over the early history. One thing I did want to mention is you mentioned the Edinoverie, which I think is a good time to talk about the different types of Old Ritualists. Mm-hmm. Of course, the followers of Avokum, these people that said that anyone who had ever used the quote-unquote new rite were devoid of grace, a lot of these people became what is known as bez popovsti,
Priestless.
priestless.
Yeah.
And a lot of people talk about the popovsti, which I know a lot of people watching right now might be very familiar with the popovsti ones, but a majority of old ritualists were and still are bez popovsti. And I think this is actually a good time to read Father Victor Simon, which Father Simon, if this will load properly, he was a man who joined the Rocorps in the 1980s. He joined in the 1980s, and he was a former baseball posse. He was part of this group that joined the Rocorps. Now, this article is on Rocorps studies, which I don't necessarily recommend, but let's see. It's from Archpriest Konstantin Fedorov, summer 1994, in the Pravoslavnaya
Mm-hmm.
Rus numbered pretext here is the interview with Archpriest Konstantin Fedorov, who reposed in 2019. So no new Rocorps. I know Father Pimen Simon was also very big on the Anschluss, but that's neither here nor there. Representative of the Rocorps Synod of Bishops in Russia in the 1990s, and the Deputy Superior of our Hermitage Our Lady of Kursk in Mailbach, New York, etc., etc. So this is Father. Let's see if I can find it. I think it's later on in this article. Where is it? It's in this article somewhere. As you could probably tell, for everyone watching, this is a bit chaotic what our stream is tonight. So, did I get the right article? I think I might not have the right article. This is not the right article. Wrong article. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there because I thought I had the right one. So this article, I apologize, is There is More to Our Mission by the Archpriest Pimen Simon. So this is June 23rd, 2010 in Erie, Pennsylvania. An interview with Archpriest Pimen Simon, who for over 30 years has been the rector of an old ritualist congregation in Erie, Pennsylvania. Father Pimen challenges the stereotypical image of the narrow-minded old believer. His talk at the fourth Pan Diaspora Council in San Francisco is a perfect example of Father Pimen's honest and realistic approach to church issues. Father Pimen holds a degree in law, but for the last 20 years he has been teaching Russian studies at Mercyhurst College in Erie. So this is Father Pimen's writings. Your ancestors for several generations were old believers. What caused you to reconsider the faith of your fathers and joined the new ritualist? I was raised a diligent old believer. Even though my parents, as well as my brother and sister, were born and raised in America, nevertheless, my upbringing in the old rite of the Russian Church was quite diligent. I suppose, fortunately for me, I attended a 3-year summer seminary taught by our nastavnik, spiritual mentor. That's but they don't have priests in the Bispal Pavsti, so they call their leaders nastavniks, who gave me and a couple other people a higher church education than most priestless old believers have. We studied topics such as the world's religions, the Bible, the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, history of the Christian Church, and so forth. During those studies, I became aware, as he taught us, that our position as priestless old believers was really an irregularity, but an irregularity that was not caused by us and probably not rectifiable. Thus, hopefully, it was something that God would understand. Yes, we can't have the hierarchy and we can't have Holy Communion, but God would understand our predicament. And perhaps it was better that we didn't partake of Holy Communion because we weren't worthy of having these sacraments any longer. I think this rationalization came about from the growth of a mentality of unworthiness in Russia that originated in the late Middle Ages. It seems evident to me that's why infrequent communion became so common in Russia as well. When I became an adult and I was an attorney, a lawyer, I was still very active in the church. We had a crisis in our church where we had to ask the nastavnik to resign. Before that person became a parish nastavnik, we had a long-time nastavnik who was my mentor, but he had retired and moved to Millville, New Jersey, where there was another priestless old believer community. But as mentioned earlier, then we had a nastavnik who had personal problems, and the parish was literally dying. Our parishioners had been living in America for 3 generations, and most of them by now understood little about the faith or the history of the Russian Church and its ramifications for us. Less and less parishioners were coming to services or parish activities, and it came to the point where my wife felt obligated for the parish's sake. I had to leave the practice of law and become a nastavnik. When I became a full-time nastavnik, for the first time I had the opportunity to really start going through the church books. If you're a golovchik, choir director, as I was in our church, a person who starts the singing, then you're looking at the Festal Menayan, or the Octai, and you're only looking in the Great Vespers for how to sing, Lord, I have cried, Sicaria, and so forth. But now, as a nastavnik, I would look at the books and look at the read instructions in the beginning. For the first time, I would read about the royal doors, read about the priest putting on the vestments, the priest sensing around the altar, about the blessing of the loaves. I began to go, oh, we're really missing a great deal in our priestless services. As an old believer, I was always under the impression that we had retained everything have royal doors, and if we didn't have the blessing of the loaves, it was because these were Nikonian editions. For the first time, I became aware that there were things that we were not really doing, but the quote-unquote Nikonians are still doing. Now, this article is long, and I highly recommend reading it, but it shows that, especially the priestless variety of old believers, these people just got very nutty. They started claiming that things like Holy Communion were not necessary anymore. They started claiming that royal doors and blessing of loaves was a Nikonian innovation to the church. And that's really the only article I'm going to read about the baseball papacy, but I will go over some of these groups because I think some of them are worth going over just to give people a mentality of the baseball papacy. Though it seems like nowadays when we hear about Old Ritualist, people are mostly talking about popovsty. So this is from Wikipedia, but I will just go over a few of these groups, and there's more. But the biggest one is the Pomorian Old Orthodox Church, or the Nilosti, not to be confused with the Pomors, who are like a Tatar ethnic group, like Turks. They initially rejected marriage. They said that marriage was also no longer necessary in the church, and basically believed in free love. And they also, at some point, started rejecting praying for the Tsar. In fact, at one point, they started rejecting monarchy altogether. It's over there, and I don't feel like getting it up because I'm lazy. But, on most of our crosses, like our crucifixes, it will usually say in Slavonic, above, like how it's said in the Bible, that above our Lord, it said Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. In Russian, of course, it's Isus Nazaretsky, Zaritsia, Judea. And some of these priestless old believers, like the Pomorians, they started rejecting this. They started taking it off the crosses that Jesus Christ was King of the Jews, and they started saying that Christ was not king at all. And that was a misunderstanding of the Jews, and they started saying it was heresy to call Christ king. And they split into two different groups, the Novo Primorci and the Stare Primorci, who the Stare Primorci still rejected marriage, and the Novo Primorci started actually doing like a lay marriage thing. There was the Fidoliesevci, which they still exist, but they called themselves the Society of Christian Old Believers of the Old Pomorci Unmarried Confession. These people rejected the free love thing that the Pomorians were doing, and they decided to all become monastic. So they're basically like Russian Shakers. So there's that group. There was one of the more infamous ones, the Philippians, named after their founder, Philip. They were oppressed by the Russian government, and they started practicing self-immolation. Like the Buddhist monk pouring gasoline over yourself and lighting yourself on fire. And they called this self-martyrdom, which when I read about some of these baseball groups, and we'll just read about one more, the Chausovinenie, who had priests, but later shifted to a priestless practice. But at first, they were going around doing like Presbyterian, ordinations where they're all laying hands on people and they made them priests and they didn't need bishops anymore. So reading about some of these Popovsky groups and how the main one rejects marriage, I will just be blunt, these people are crazy. And I noticed that most people don't talk about Bezpopovsky, they want to talk about Popovsky. Of course, just reading about some of these Bezpopovsky groups, and I'm sure there are some that are probably more normal because there's a billion of these groups. There's tons of them. They're basically like Russian Protestants. There's a lot of them. Some of them got involved with the spiritual Christians, like the Helisti, which like Rasputin was a member of. So we'll talk about the first group of Popovsky. And this chair that I'm sitting in is broken, which is why I'm constantly repositioning myself. Was the Belaya Krynica group, the Rosguardia Cemetery, or was it the Rogosetie Cemetery? I can look it up. I will admit Russian is not, I'm not very Russian, so I will not claim that I'm very good at it. Let's see. The Rogoshevskoy Cemetery. So, no, Rasputin was not an old ritualist. He was a Helist, which I'm just mentioning that some of these people some of the old ritualists, the Bezpopovsky groups, got involved with the quote-unquote spiritual Christians like the Helisti. And our dearest brother Simon mentioned the Dubkhars, which another group like that. Anyway, the Bila Kunitskaya hierarchy was founded in the 1840s, and Vladimir Enoch mentioned.
If I could just stop you one moment, Sava, I have to go, so I'm just going to say goodbye, right? And it was nice talking to you again. All right, Sava.
Oh yes, your
All right,
blessing.
God bless. All right, I pray you have a blessed rest of Lent, and especially Holy Week coming up, and glorious Pascha. All right, God bless. Bye.
Thank you, Vladika. Okay, so I guess back to us. So Vladika Enoch mentioned the Bela Krynica hierarchy. Of course, as you mentioned, Metropolitan Ambrosi, or Ambrose, he didn't really know Slavonic or Russian at all. And there were some very strange things around his ordination or consecration. They said he was an Orthodox bishop, even though he was a Nikonian who did the sign of the cross like this, and then they poured chrism over his head, but then he was a valid bishop. He was a deposed EP bishop. He was not really considered a real bishop by the time of by the time that he got involved with the Old Ritualist in Austria, because there was an Austrian Empire, or Lipovia, I think that's how it's pronounced. I could be wrong. So this was in the 1840s that the Old Ritualists finally got a hierarchy, and thus Popovsky groups that weren't like doing Presbyterian ordinations became a thing again. Now, of course, Metropolitan Ambrose started doing a bunch of single-handed consecrations, and these were corrected within itself. But one thing that is worth knowing about the Bilokrinica hierarchy, which we'll talk about another hierarchy soon enough, and that goes into the modern situation of the Old Ritualistic Popovsky groups, at least. Because honestly, I will be perfectly blunt, the base Popovsky are not really worth talking about. And most people are not interested about those people. So, Bilokrinica, they had a bunch of hierarchs, and around the 1890s, I think, most of their bishops had reposed, and they were down to one bishop who was their metropolitan, a Metropolitan Sifroni. And Sifroni was defrocked, he was excommunicated. They kicked him out of their own church, and they were left orphaned once again. And I will admit, I have tried to find out why Sifroni Bilokrinica was excommunicated, but try as I might, I cannot find solid reasons. There appear to be moral accusations. There appear to be all sorts of accusations against him. So by the 1890s, the Bielokrinice hierarchy was once again left orphaned. They were left without bishops. And this is where the interesting part comes, which he's in the chat, our dearest brother Simon. He goes by the name Isaac here. But this is where the interesting part comes in. I would love to show this on screen, but I'm afraid of putting it. A lot of people here might be familiar with a story about Saint Andre.
If you have a link and you put it in the private chat, I can share it.
Yes. I used Google Translate here. I don't like Google Translate. This book is by Saint Andre of Juffa, which I know a lot of people are probably going to ask about that in particular. So Saint Andre of Juffa was a catacomnic bishop. He was a new martyr of Russia. He's a saint of the Orthodox
sharing can
Church.
sometimes cause delays.
People from the yes, I was noticing that, but I also have very bad internet. So this is translated from Abkhazia.ru or Abkhazia.ru. And this is called The History of My Old Believers by St. Andre. Now, I point this book up. It's a very long book. I just pointed up on screen so people can look for it. If you could put in the original Russian so people can maybe search it up, just so they can see the title. But if you look this up, you can find it. He took in some of these old and gave them a hierarchy. And at first, the Bielokrinice people got their orders after they were left orphaned by St. Andre of Juffa. And after a few years, which I will have to pull up something on my phone, which I know horrible manners, but after a few years, they broke communion with St. Andre and they went and got their orders corrected by a renovationist bishop, which I can find the name of it real quick. Yes, they rejected St. Andre and they went and received a renovationist bishop, Nikola Pozdniev, and they received him by chrismation, and he was a priest, but they received him and he corrected their orders. So the Bielokrinice hierarchy that exists today had their orders corrected by the renovationists. And then later they found another catacomnic bishop, Stefan Rostogiev, which Saint Andre in this book right here has very choice words for the Bielokrinice people, but that's how they got their modern orders, was from a renovationist bishop. Which there's another thing I will share here. Which, let's see, this is interesting. So I'm pulled it up in the chat. It's another translated article, and it's from a website that has a lot of really good articles about the Old Ritualist and kind of shows a lot of the inconvenient truths about them. And did my computer crash again? Okay, no, yeah. This is gulevsirki.info. I just posted in the private chat. And this talks about by the time of the Second World War, what the Bielokrinice hierarchy was up to. The Bishop Irenard, who was their first hierarch, blessed Stalin in that article, which I don't know if you're there, Father. You're muted at the moment.
Which article did you want me to go to?
I just posted the second one in the private chat, the Gulev Sirki .info.
Got it. Give me a second.
Yes, sorry. Yes, so yes, this is from a website that has a lot of information about the Old Ritualist, but this is the Church of Stalin, which I'll read a little bit of it on my end.
And you froze there, Sama? I think he's frozen. You might want to reset your connection. Okay. Saba, if you can hear me, you might want to restart your connection.
Okay, there we go. So all the hierarchs of the biblical hierarchy were arrested by the OGPU, NKVD, all but one, but a majority of them were arrested and then released. And this article, which is trying to load on my screen, but it doesn't want to load. And I'm okay. Here we go. Maybe it's working now. Maybe it's working now. Okay. So I will read this article. It's not too long. So this is from Church of Stalin on the Golosevki.info website. A significant event has taken place. Oh, please wait. In Ukraine, the archives of the NG Russian Orthodox Church. Of course, it was no secret that before the Patriarchate was formed from the Chekist agents of Joseph Stalin. But when the original documents were brought to light, history appeared with all of its inexorable reality. The expansion of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine has been long a problem for the country's eternal life. And this situation has become especially acute now, when against the backdrop of Russian aggression, the Russian Orthodox Church has shown itself to be a conductor of Kremlin influence and all sorts of neo-Sovietism. It is enough to recall how Russian priests were hysterical about the demolition of monuments to Bolshevik executioners and inspired the war against Ukraine. And the parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church have always been a source of anti-Ukrainian sentiment. Now, when the documents have been made public that expose the true origins of this organization, its neo-Bolshevik essence has been fully exposed. Now you say that the church should be politically neutral. In this connection, a direct parallel with the modern official Old Believer confession suggests itself. After all, they are all recreated exactly like the Nikonian Patriarchate, with direct government sanction. In the same years, why did Stalin suddenly decide to legalize church organizations? There are quite reasonable versions of this account. The most important seems to be a corresponding demand of the Allies as a condition for the opening of Second Front. And also, after all, something had to be done with those 8,000 parishes the Germans opened in the territories liberated from Bolshevism. They could not be closed again. It is true, unlike the Patriarchate, the Old Believer confessions were very few in number and were not taken seriously by the authorities, and therefore there was not such a strong penetration of the Cheka agents as in the Russian Orthodox Church. The Old Believer episcopate can hardly be suspected. In general, the authorities were content with assigning special curators, like the permanent secretary of the Archiepiscopal K.A. Abrikosov, an individual recruited priest who kept the Moscow archbishops in fear, like priest Georgy Ustinov, who, because of blackmail, Archbishop Nikodem Latsiev shamefully abandoned his throne to the mercy of fate and fled to Moldavia, where he remained until the end of his days, and the Ustinov family clan tightly occupied the Rogozhivskoye cemetery. However, one gets the impression that the Rogov bishops glorified the Soviet power not out of fear, but out of conscience. This is evidenced not only by the pompous diatherems of the Bolshevik power from Archbishop Irenark Parfenov, but also by the quite sincere mutual congratulations of the bishops on the Soviet holidays. Only with the death of Archbishop Nikodem was it possible to largely eradicate the Soviet spirit from the church, the main source of which was destroyed by the aged Bishop Anastasy Kononov, appointed locum tenens of the Moscow throne. There was a national holiday in Rozhevsky when Bishop Anastasy banned priest Georgy Ustinov from serving and drove representatives of his family clan from key administrative positions. Now, this article goes into further detail. I will just read to about there, but this shows how much the Belokrinitsa hierarchy felt the Sergianism, just like it's not really the Russian Orthodox Church, but what we now call the Moscow Patriarchate. And this was around the war years. It goes into a bunch of other unsavory things. Our dearest brother Simon sent this to me. So that's one thing. And now there's the other hierarchy, which we briefly mentioned, which I will try to pronounce this correctly. There was three major Popovsky hierarchies. The other ones is the Novosibirskaya hierarchy, or what is now called the Russian Old Orthodox Church, which that was the one that St. Andrei was involved with. I was corrected here. But we'll talk about a third category of Old Ritualists before we move on much further here, and that is Edinoverie. Edinoverie, the first Edinoverie groups were taken in under Tsar Pavel I, who I know some people think he's a martyr. I know some people know Rokor believe that. He was on the Rokor calendar, Tsar Martyr Pavel I, who was a son of Peter the Great, or grandson. I don't remember exactly, but he was the first one to try to take in Old Ritualists. From the second, Vladika Enoch mentioned that. And Saint Tsar Nikolai II also tried to take in many people as Edinoverie. Saint Nikon was very big on that. And actually, the treasurer of the Russian Orthodox Church by the time of the Bolshevik Revolution was an Edinoverie bishop by the name of Saint Simon Shliv. He was martyred by the Bolsheviks. We do recognize him as a martyr. But there were Old Ritualists who were in communion with the church, which I know people always say, well, if old calendarists, quote unquote, if true Orthodox aren't schismatic, how are Old Ritualists schismatic? And I think a very important thing is like what Vladika Enoch was mentioning, that these people have proved themselves to be in the point where the church had never been before, without bishops, and which has never happened. There's been times where there's been few bishops, but never been times where there was no bishops left anywhere in the church. We see a bunch of very questionable decisions occurring and very questionable ecclesiology being developed, because as the Holy Father says, schism usually always leads into heresy. And I think, of course, the most standard definition of schism comes from St. Basil the Great in the book On the Holy Spirit. He says that schismatics are keeping the confession of faith, but they're not in the communion of the rest of the church. So people say, how is that different than the true Orthodox? Well, we kept the true confession of faith, and we know that the innovation, the charge of schism would be against the new calendarists. And as we've mentioned before, this is not really a comparable position to the true Orthodox, as the Old Ritualists, of course, were resisting against making the sign of the cross with three fingers and other things, not because this was trying to get the church closer to heretics, but just because they felt like it, basically. So that leads us to the modern state of the Popovsky groups. There's, of course, the Bielokrinitsa hierarchy, which I wanted to show pictures of, which I have one picture, which is on a YouTube video from a good friend of mine, Grigi de Capeliti, which I'll post in the private chat. The picture is only really what's noteworthy here, but this, if you could put it on screen, if it'll load for you, which I know we're having lots of technical problems here tonight, but the thing I just put in the private chat is a picture over there next to Kirill Gundayev on the right there, is the first hierarch of the Bielokrinitsa hierarchy, right there, sort of where your cursor is, Father. That is Metropolitan Kornali. And as you can see, he's at an event with Kirill Gundayev. The video isn't really important. It's just this picture is a Buddhist Lama, two Muslims, a Chabad Rebbe, and an Armenian bishop of some sort. And there's multiple pictures of Kornali at
It's Corneli. It's based on Cornelius.
Oh, Corneli, sorry. There's many pictures of Metropolitan Corneli at events like this, in praying with Muslims and Jews and Buddhists. He's fully involved in ecumenism. And there's a few interesting things to mention about him. We're not going to talk about him all night, of course. But, of course, the modern Bielokrinitsa hierarchy, we know that they blessed Stalin, and they essentially did the same thing as Sergei Shkodorodsky with Sergianism, and they're now involved in ecumenism. We have plenty of pictures of such like this one. Recently, this is another great thing that Simon sent to me. They had a schism within the Belokrinica hierarchy with their Romanian church, the Livonian church, and their Ukrainian eparchy. They broke communion with Corneli, which I have another thing I can post in the private chat here, which briefly talks about it. This article, I'm not going to read over all of it, but it mentions the break in communion. And one thing that is noteworthy is that the metropolitan of the Romanian church, the Livonian eparchy, sent a letter like this one that is pictured. And Corneli responded with a letter quite literally saying, I can pray with whoever I want, whenever I want. So this is the modern, this is the largest of the Old Ritualist groups. They're very ecumenist, very Sergianist. This article here explains a little bit of it. So yeah, it mentions the World Union of Old Ritualist. And this will be the last thing we really talk about with Belokrinica, which I don't have the article here, but Simon did send me something from it. So a few years ago, the Belokrinica hierarchy and the Novosibirsk hierarchy, Zibovia hierarchy. My Russian's terrible. I'm Serbian. I barely speak English or Serbian. I am an idiot, sorry. They had some sort of dialogue a few years ago, and one of the things that the other hierarchy, which is the one that elected their own patriarch, they wanted Belokrinica to condemn ecumenism, which Michborn Corneli refused to do. So they refused to do that. They also refused to condemn the Moscow Patriarch and a few other things. So this church, the Belokrinica hierarchy, is just openly ecumenist, openly Sergianist. They're not very serious people. I have dealt with a few of them over the years, and they're nice people. But let's see if I can talk about this other group. Yes. So just pulling up notes here. This article is interesting for anyone that wants to read it. But the other hierarchy, what's called itself the Russian Old Orthodox Church, I think that's the one. In 2003, they elected their patriarch. Their Archbishop Alexander Kalinin became Patriarch Alexander. And this group, they have a website in Russian, and it looks ancient. And they have questionable origins, of course, dealing with the with Saint Andrei of Urfa, and they have some other questionable things as well. They were in communion with the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians under Metropolitan Kyriakos, which I have thoughts on them as well. But they were in communion, but or not in communion, a dialogue. They were in dialogue, communications with Metropolitan Kyriakos' Sobor or Synod. And that didn't really go anywhere. And then I think 2 years ago, this group under this Alexander Kalinin issued an anathema against Nikonianism. So it appears that they consider everyone else to be terrible and schismatic and Nikonian heretics, which of course isn't in a consistent position with what these people believe. So that's the modern state of the Poplavsky groups. As you can see, it's not very good. Of course, with the Edinoverie, Saint Philaret took in some of these Bezpoplavsky people in America, and they formed a little Edinoverie community in the Rokor. And Father Piman Simon, who we were reading an article from him earlier, was involved in that. Sorry. That group was, there's a lot of things I could say about it, but I know St. Philaret lifted the anathema against the old rite people and the old rite itself, and he sent an apology to them as well. A lot of that came at the assistance of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, from my
I was
understanding.
going to say the urging of Alexander
Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn. He was very big on that.
Yes, which that was a whole other thing. The Rokor, let's just say they were fighting with the OCA to try to see who they could get in, if they could get Alexander Solzhenitsyn into their church, because he was a celebrity and whatnot. But I know, for example, Father Seraphim of Plantina thought this was a horrible decision. And I was going to read some letters from Father Seraphim of Plantina about the Old Ritualists, but they took in this community and they had it was a heavy Edinoverie community. However, I know from some personal anecdotes I've heard is that they were quite weird, because some of these baseball prophecy people, some of them didn't even get with the program. Like they were still making icons of Avokum and Pavul of Kulumna, and whenever the bishops would show up, they would just hide the icons. So even some of these people in the Rokor were a bit questionable, but they were brought into communion with the church. There was Edinoverie people prior to the revolution, including some who were saints. Nowadays, within the Moscow Patriarchate, they have a rather large Edinoverie community, but at this point, there's really nothing different between Belokrinitsa and Edinoverie with the Moscow Patriarchate anyway, because they're both ecumenists and Sergianists. Now, I will at least mention that there are some Edinoverie in communion with true Orthodox. In particular, I know of a community in Birmingham in the United Kingdom under the Metropolitan Philaret II, who leads a little Rokor group that is separated from Metropolitan Vitali, descended from Metropolitan Vitali. I know their hierodeacon over there, and he's a very nice man. So I usually tell people, if they can't get enough of the old rite, there's a Edinoverie True Orthodox monastery in the United Kingdom. If you really have to see it, you can go see that. I was told recently that the Rokana under Archbishop Safroni, a Petrograd, has a priest who's apparently old rite and does some Edinoverie stuff. There are true Orthodox Edinoverie out there, but as I hopefully have highlighted, I don't really know why anyone would consider the old rite and the new rite to be so radically different that they have to have one over the other, because they're not really two different rites, but different usages within the same rite. And some of those usages are not entirely correct, which I think is a good point, here to not end on. I have a few.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Not to end. I do have a few things I want to read, some final notes. But Saint Tikhon and Saint Andre talks about this in that book that we showed earlier. They used every form of economia and condescension to try to get these people to go back to the church. They admitted they were wrong multiple times. They tried to do anything they could to get these people back in the church, and many of them have still persisted into their schism to this day, which has now devolved into various different forms of heresies. I don't think lighting yourself on fire counts as auto-martyrdom. I'm pretty sure that's called suicide.
Yeah.
Well, as an ortho-adjust, who I know is a former Raskolnik himself, he would never go back, and that's good. And I think a lot of people present this issue like the old ritualists are the most trad or based and red.
It's trad romanticism, which is what I was complaining about at the beginning. That's all it is.
It really isn't. And of course, the ecclesiology, this is much different than the true Orthodox, which is a common thing that's thrown against us. You guys are just like the old ritualists, and no, we're not.
That's exactly why I didn't want to do this stream.
So I hope that some of these things, maybe this brief introduction to the topic, dispelled some rumors and some myths for some people. I do want to end the stream with a few readings that I didn't really know where else to put them in here. So the first one is this article, which I know you might immediately shrug when you hear this article. It was written by Peter Lukainov, who I know is not popular. I have thoughts on him.
This is which
in
one?
This article,
This is the Ortho-Christian one?
Yes, the Ortho-Christian one, which there's only one part I want to read from this. This is
Okay.
apparently some anecdotes from Peter Lukainov about St. John of Shanghai. St. John.
Where
It says,
where is
regarding the
it?
history of the Russian. If you put Control F and look up Nikon, it should come up pretty quickly. So.
Okay, I'm trying. Hold on. Give me a moment.
Okay, yes, you're very close. You're very close. So, yes, here we go. So I'll be reading from where the first line is here. Regarding the history of the Russian Church, Vodika, St. John, had a great respect for Patriarch Nikon. I recall that Vodika was once present in school at the examinations on the law of God. One girl was questioned on the reforms of the Russian Church. She answered very well, and at the end, Vodika asked her if Patriarch Nikon was a great man. She, following the traditional academic views of our textbooks, replied that he was not. Vodika, who usually listened very patiently to children, stopped her and said sternly, "No, Patriarch Nikon was the greatest of Russian patriarchs." Vodika likewise highly regarded the works of Metropolitan Peter Mogila. So, if you read a lot of people when they talk about Patriarch Nikon, they say that his deposition, as Vodika Enoch was talking about, was very unfair and possibly not even canonical. And a lot of people, including St. John Maximovich, had a very high respect of Patriarch Nikon and basically said that he was a saint. So that's the first thing I will read. Second thing, I will read a few letters from Father Serafim Aplantina, which this you can find by, I've just posted the links. It's the Thoughts Intrusive. Reader Christopher recommended this. That last article was recommended by Fyodor McLoin, Fyodor of Texas, which a lot of people... I'll give thanks to everyone who helped with the stream at the end, at least with my part in it, because I didn't do much of my own here, really. But if you look up believers in this, it will come to a few articles. It's mentioned, I think, 20 times, but I'm not going to read over every single thing here. So the first letter they'll talk about, which I feel like is kind of important to our modern time. It's from Father Serafim Aplantina, dated November 1st, Old Style, 14th, New Style, 1971, the Feast of Saints
Platina.
Cosmas and Damian. Platina. Sorry. So
No N.
Yes, sorry, Platina. Yes, sorry. So this is addressed to Father Nikotas. So we'll skip to this section here. It says, "Sorry to hear about John Shaw's offensive letter. We met him last year at St. Herman's canonization, and then he came here for a few hours with a group of seminarians. He's a Jordanville graduate of this year, a convert, an orphan, some kind of descendant of G.B. Shaw, who, as I understand, was raised by Father Dmitry Alexandrov, who has a mission to the old believers, which has always seemed to us to be an academic thing, and has made himself noticeable at Jordanville by his adherence to some old believer customs." And now he talks a little bit about Bishop Petros of Astoria and Father Pantaleimon, but let's just see. We'll skip to this part. But most of all, he probably has a bad case of what Russians call self-opinion, or just plain conceit, of the young convert graduate type, and it is probably incidental to him just how he proves that he is more orthodox than you or anyone else, which, I think he mentions this in another letter. Let's see, where's his letter? Yes, so not this one. Okay, he mentions a little bit more about John Shaw, and that's Jerome Shaw, for anyone that's wondering. And he talks a little bit more about this academic fascination with the Old Ritualist. So the next letter that I skipped to is November 21st, 1974, entry into the temple. Dear Father Ephraim. This is one of the things I was mentioning. Ivlogiti, greetings on the feast of the Most Holy Theotokos. We read with joy your recent letter to us and pray that the elder is recovering well. May God preserve him for many years of fruitful labors in Christ's vineyard. What we've been hearing about this recent Sobor doesn't strike us too well. Metropolia, Old Believers, etc. A step backward instead of to forward? Let us know your impressions. We hope to talk to Vladika Nektari soon about it. So far, we have all heard from him that this was a pale idea. So this is from February 1st/14th, 1974, Mother Tryphon to Valery Lukainov. He says, the more that we... Lukainov, sorry.
Lukianov.
That's the right... The more we hear of the Jordanville Sobor, or at least the Bishop's Sobor after everyone else left, the more discouraged we are. We still don't understand what was the purpose of the decree on the Old Believers. The question of the canonization of Blessed Zinnia was postponed, evidently, from what Vladika Nektari tells us, because it is unimportant. There is no support shown for the zealots on Mount Athos who are suffering persecution for true orthodoxy. Our friends in Greece write us that old calendars are expecting...
one moment, Saba. Ortho Just says $10. Thank you. Yes, thank you for helping support the channel. We really appreciate it.
Yes. So, this article, this Father Seraphim is essentially saying here, he doesn't understand why they even did this thing with the Old Ritualist in the first part. And as he puts it here, there was more important things to be discussed, like the old calendars who are being persecuted and glorifying saints of recent memory. So another letter from September 21st/October 4th, 1975, Saint Demetrius of Rostov, addressed to Alexei. About the Handaish Old Believer visit, yes, you are blowing it up too much. It is not possible to have dialogue with them. They are sectarians, and their spirit, not just their externals, separates them from orthodoxy. If God can somehow draw one or many of them to orthodoxy, very good. But the measures of penitence, which John Handaish, I don't know how to pronounce. Hadanish, okay, describes would be simply a flattering of their sectarian pride. Blessed Paisi Velichkovsky was against receiving old believers, even if they asked nothing but to keep the two-fingered cross, not because of the small act, but because this revealed they still had a sectarian mentality. Of course, since then the Russian Church has allowed old believers to retain the two-fingered cross in their service books, but as a gesture of economy rather than an admission that Patriarch Nikon was wrong. For an old believer to become orthodox, there must be an awareness that the externals they preserve are not of the essence of orthodoxy. Father Dmitry Alexandrov, by the way, has visited them, or at least some old believers in Oregon, and saw no hope for dialogue. So this is the same letter, and this is the postscript. The postscriptum, the old believer Pimen Sofroniov, the iconographer, under the persuasion of Father Dmitry Alexandrov, received Holy Communion some months before he died in one of our churches in the Holy Land. But of course, he was not at all a strict old believer, as the real sectarians are. I don't know if he was in communion with the Oregon old believers or not, but if so, they would never believe that he had done such a thing. So here's another letter. It's a postscript of a letter dedicated October 2nd/15th, 1975, Saints Cyprian and Justina, also to Alexei. So this is the postscript, which talks a little bit more about John Shaw. John Shaw, we know, he visited us and other seminarians at the time of St. Herman's canonization. He is a convert, an orphan brought up by Father Dmitry Alexandrov, and rather touched on the subject of old believers. He thinks they are right and the Orthodox wrong. He crosses himself demonstratively with two fingers, etc., which makes him a good match for Father Pantaleimon and his followers, for whom he long ago developed some kind of distaste. He is Archbishop Nikon's secretary. Let them fight it out together, and we who have important things to do can peacefully do them. So the next letter is October 22nd, November 4th, 1975, Kazansky, Mother of God, equal to the Apostles, Everki. Dear Alexei, concerning the old believers, your observations and Nina's seem sober and give about the picture of them that we expected. Certainly, there is no harm in continued personal contact with them, but as you correctly see, don't even think of them as being any kind of intermediary. Don't think of being any kind of intermediary between them and the Synod.
Nikolai Bauman writes, there's an
If they want
interesting
to become
article
you to adopt,
written. Oh, okay. I was just going to read the comments here. There's an interesting article by Rokor Lehman about the Archbishop Anthony asking forgiveness of the old believers in Oregon. Should be on the Rokor Studies website. Oh, well, there you go. Bishop Shaw would make a great topic all by himself. What a career. Yeah, I can kind of agree with that.
it'd be a topic. If they
It'd
want
be
to
a
become
topic,
Orthodox,
all right.
yeah. If they want to become Orthodox, it will come up in due time. If they want you to adopt old believer customs, they should know it's a waste of time.
I like the John Hudanish seems the convert enthusiast type who will easily fall into disillusionment when his dreams are punctured. With him, it's best to be as open as possible and not to let him keep illusions that will be exploded by everyday reality.
Yes.
I will just note that is that's the mentality of a lot of old believer sympathizers on the internet. So I just had to throw that in.
So there's a very brief mention in the next letter. That's just talking about the Moscow Patriarch taking a bunch of Edinoverie. So that's next one, which is in the letter January 3rd, 16th, 1976, St. Genevieve, Paris, also to Alexei. Let's see. We got a long letter from John Hundaish, who wants to visit Hudanish. Is that an Arabic name?
No, that's I would say Carpatho-Russian.
Okay, I couldn't recognize it. Who wants to visit us with someone or other next month? Frankly, there is something very artificial and fake about his attitudes, which was only emphasized by the fact that he wrote in Russian, with some very artificial expressions. The battle of the old believers for the survival of their traditions, though of course one can't but sympathize with, is not the same battle we Orthodox Christians are fighting to keep alive the spirit of orthodoxy. Everywhere the spirit is being quenched, and the preservation of old customs isn't going to help when the spirit is gone. And let's see, there's another one to Alexei, Saints Athanasius and Saint Kirill Alexandria, dear Alexei. So second thing here, I'll just read. I suspect that your smoking was the trap that called. I will probably get the name wrong a few more times until I get it right. Hundaish. He knows that it is so obviously wrong, and from his old believer contacts, he has a thing about being right, and looking at the rest of what he has seen and heard of you in a new light. He sees many wrong things, which also wouldn't have paid much attention to if he hadn't been caught by the smoking. If you just start reading these letters, I think we could really stop right about here. There's only a few more mentions of the old believers in Father Seraphim's letters, but it's almost like he's talking about the exact same thing that we are seeing online with online old ritualists today, where there's this fascination of being more correct and pursuing this for some academic, vainglorious...
It's a LARP. That's all it is. It's a LARP.
Yes.
If the person is not actually from an old believer family, it's a LARP. That's how I see it.
So I will stop reading the letters of Father Seraphim here because he gives a pretty clear picture about the old ritualist. There's a few more things I will read before I finish up and maybe give some final thoughts.
Okay.
I will read from The Way of the Pilgrim, which I have a physical copy, but I'm reading it off Google Books because I decided to be fancy today. I pulled it up here. So this is from the Pilgrim Continues His Way. This is as he's traveling to Kiev. So, quoting from section 134 here. For some 130 miles or so, I traveled none too happily, for the road lay through pothouses and Jewish villages, and I seldom came across a Christian dwelling. At one farm I noticed a Russian Christian inn, and I was glad to see it. I turned in to spend the night, and also to ask for some bread for my journey. For my rusks were coming to an end. Here I saw the host, an old man with a well-to-do air, and who, I learned, came from the same government that I did, the Orlovsky. Directly I went to the room, and his first question was, "What religion are you?" I replied that I was Christian and Pravoslavny, Orthodox. "Pravoslavny indeed," he said with a laugh. "You people are Pravoslavny only in word. Once tempted me, and I tried it. I joined your church and stayed in it for 6 months. After that, I came back to the ways of our society. To join your church is just a snare. The readers mumble the services all anyhow, with things missed out and things you can't understand. And the singing is no better than you'd hear in a pub. And the people stand all in a huddle, men and women all mixed up. They talk while the service is going on, turn round about and stare about, walk to and fro, and give you no peace and quiet to say your prayers. What sort of worship do you call that? It's just a sin. Now with us, how devout the service is. You can hear what's said. Nothing is missed out. The singing is most moving, and the people stand quietly. The men by themselves, the women by themselves, and everybody knows what reverence to make and when. That's prostrations, as Holy Church directs. Really and truly, when you come to the church of ours, you feel that you have the power, you have come to worship of God. But in the one of yours, you can't imagine what you've come to uh, church, to the church or to the market. From all this, I could see that the old man was a die-hard Raskolnik. But he spoke so plausibly I could not argue with him nor convert him. I just thought to myself that it will be impossible to convert the old believers to the true church until church services are put right among us, and until the clergy in particular set an example in this. The Raskolnikin knows nothing of the inner life. He relies upon externals, and it is about them that and it is about them that we are so careless. So I wanted to get away from here, and had already gone out from the hall when, to my surprise, through the open door of a private room, I saw a man who did not look Russian, and this goes into a different section of the book. But this really uh, shows the mentality of the old ritualist. Now, The Way of the Pilgrim is a well-esteemed work, and some people say it's a work of fiction. I don't personally think it is. That's one other thing. And the last thing I think I'll read comes from this book, which I showed earlier, The Life of St. Theodorus Anaxar. And it's about, let's see. So this is recorded in two places, but let's see. I think it's page 71. So this is from the section, Three Novices Who Disobeyed Elder Theodore, from the notes of Archimandrite Theophan. Yes. The third novice was an Alexei Andreevich from the town of Kishima, what his father did not know, but it was heard that they lived with sufficient means. Alexei, leaving the monastery, came to his father's house and began to ask him to build a cell in the garden for the life of seclusion. His father fulfilled his wish eagerly, and Alexei started to live as a recluse. But inasmuch as he did not have an instructor, he took it upon himself to fast according to his own understanding, and went to such an extreme that he no longer knew who he was. The old believers, learning of his life, began to come to him and lure him to their sect, and actually accomplished this. They had tonsured him and clothed him according to the old ritualist practice. His father left him to himself, but it seems that God remembered the labors that he endured and did not allow him to die in delusion. One novice of the Synaxar monastery from the merchant class, Philip Filipovich, lived at the time of the Florshev hermitage, learned about the novice Alexei, with whom he had lived together at Synaxar, and wanted to visit him. He came to his parents' house in the city of Kishina, and asked about Alexei, begging his father to let him see him. Having come to him when he saw another langur, clothed like a sectarian, and asked him, "Do you know me?" Glancing at him, he said, "You are Philip Filipovich." Philip said, "You have been led astray by the old believers. Look, your life has already come to an end. Turn to the Holy Church, confess and partake of the holy mysteries." Though he claimed that the old believers had taught him the truth, Philip nevertheless proved to him that they themselves had gone astray and had led others into ruin. Finally, with God's help, he had brought them to his senses. They called a priest who, having confessed him and given him the holy mysteries, gave him hope in God's mercy. Afterwards, Alexei soon reposed and was buried in the church by the novice Philip. So this is a story, of course, that people that usually go into some sort of form of prelest will often go to the old ritualist, which we see many times throughout the years. But, of course, as I said, I think we'll leave the To give a very quick summary, I think from the topics discussed, we can prove a few things. I think we can have enough evidence to suggest that, one, the Old Ritualists were not being persecuted for their faith, but because many of them were trying to burn down monasteries and lighting themselves on fire and trying to murder the Tsar. Excuse me. We can prove that the Old Ritualist schism is not at all similar to the modern-day True Orthodox. We can prove that the Old Ritualists have not preserved the faith. With the base Popovsky, they have gone into insane Protestant levels, and even the modern Popovsky groups are mostly all ecumenist, Sergianist, and formed on parasynagogues. They're basically parasynagogues in some cases. We can prove that the reforms were not widely rejected in any capacity, and that the Old Ritualists themselves would venerate many saints who followed the new rite, and that this was the standard throughout the Orthodox world. And we can also show that the mindset of the Old Ritualists and why people go to them is completely contrary to the spirit of orthodoxy. I feel like we presented enough information, although this is a very rudimentary, very surface level beginner's introduction to this issue. I do suggest people read more. But one of the reasons why I think, Father, you wanted to do the stream was that there is a massive bias in academia.
I didn't want to do this stream, but
Well, yes. Well,
I actually.
I think there's a.
Go ahead.
There's a massive bias in academia and intellectual crowds in favor of the Old Ritualists, which Father Seraphim was talking about with like John Shaw and others, that these people are not very serious people, and they're attracted to this stuff because they think it makes them more correct. And this is a trapping. I very much think this is a trapping and a delusion of the enemy, and not a legitimate movement. I would like to thank people that helped with sources for the stream, in particular our dearest brothers Nikolai Bauman in Texas, Fyodor McLoin in Texas, Simon in Canada, and Rita Christopher. He sent some very good resources and some very good suggestions. I would also like to thank Father Mark and our church here in Louisiana, because he actually gave me this book, which I know it's mirrored, but it's The Little Russian Philokalia, Volume 5, on St. Theodore Synaxar. This is one of the books at our church. So I would like to thank Father Mark for, of course, allowing me to borrow this book. I would also like to thank Vladika Enoch and you, of course, Father, very much for doing this stream. So.
All right. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank thank you to everyone, to Reader Sava here, to Bishop Enoch who was on as our guest, to our listeners, to those who had questions and had comments, and those who support our mission. Support the channel. We at NFTU do need your help. Support us by subscribing or donating at nftu.net. Or on Give, Send, Go. We remember all of you in our prayers, and thank you for the support for NFTU. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a good night, and may God bless you and the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
I mean,